So I think what we wanted to start off with is actually just a little bit of a question for you, which is, if I can remember how to get it, I can set up a poll. And so you should be seeing a poll coming up on your screens now. And so what we want to do is just get a feel for how you're currently doing call review and quality improvement at your agency. So if you can see the pop-up, do now just answer away. Awesome. I'm seeing some really interesting results. I don't know if you can see these too, or if it's just me that can see the results.
Henrik, you're the only one that can see the results, and I'm dying to know.
Right. So I'm seeing these. I assume everyone was seeing the live results coming in. But
no, you're like the Wizard of Oz right now. You're behind the curtain.
That's the nicest thing someone said to me all day. So right now we're seeing, I think we've got about 57% voted, and it seems to be getting sort of diminishing returns. So I will probably end it in a few moments. But what we're seeing is a large amount of people. So the first question: does your agency currently have a process for reviewing a sample of calls? Perhaps not altogether surprising, but we have 82% have said yes. And 9%, so there's only 3 people, have said no. And then there are a couple that said unknown and other, which I'm not quite sure how to interpret, but I guess that's not altogether surprising though from your perspective. That's a lot of people doing call reviews. That's quite normal, right? And then second, yeah, go on. I see.
Well, I'm just kind of curious, and I know people can't talk because this is a panel, but it's just, for me, I always wonder, like, a sample, because I know I wrote these questions, so I'm biased here of what I was expecting, and I'm not surprised by the results, but I also recognize it's like we all have our own definition of sample, which is what you're going to get to, of like what % of calls are you reviewing, and then okay, are we reviewing the high acuity calls, are we reviewing the low acuity calls? What does a review look like? Is it like an OCD down to the second by second evaluation of the call, or is it, okay, I listened to it, they didn't curse and they didn't yell at the callers, so it was a great job? So it's definitely kind of like up for interpretation of what review looks like.
I think that's a really good question, and that also sort of ties into sort of the next question on the poll, which was, so assuming yes, which that was 83% of you now. What % of your calls do you review? And the options were less than 3%. That's 23% people said that. 1 to 3%, 37% said that. That was the highest. And then we had 3 to 5%, 17% of respondents said that. And then there's still quite a lot of people. So 23% of respondents said over 5% they review, which is, that's surprisingly high.
I am shocked. So I wonder if people interpreted this, and feel free to put it in the chat. Like, yes. I'm curious if people interpreted this, if you're a dispatcher, if you interpreted this as what % of my calls do I review versus what % of an agency's calls do you review? Because if we think about cardiac arrest, which is like your quintessential call review type, those are 0.5% of all your call volume. So if you review every cardiac arrest, that's where the number is. So therefore that means most people I think review cardiac arrest calls. So it's like, what other call types are you reviewing? What else are you reviewing? All the dispatches that come out as cardiac arrest, and that's how you get above 1%? I'm kind of genuinely curious, and we'll love to see people's comments in the chat on like what types of calls they're reviewing.
And again, that goes to your question about, is it a random sample or is it a selected sample, right?
Totally.
Please do write in the comments if you have a particular way of selecting that, and also, so what percentage is that random sample versus the specially selected? And then finally, how long does it take for you to review a single cardiac arrest call with telephone CPR? And so we had basically 5 to 10 minute time slots for between 0 and 1 hour, and the vast majority are doing it within sort of 5 to 20 minutes. So that's about 55% responded. It takes them between 5 and 20 minutes, pretty much equal on either side. How long does it take you or your team to review a call?
The old way or the new way?
Well, that's a good question, right? But I guess let's start with like how you used to review calls, right?
Who here has an Excel spreadsheet and then they download the audio on a Q4 or whatever it's called player, and then you like pause the audio and you see what the timestamp is and you paste the timestamp. Oh, look, now I can see the results, Henrik.
I'm just learning how this Zoom things work. I do apologize, but
Guys,
there we go.
The Wizard of Oz is learning his magical powers. I love this. No, but like the old way, it's like you pause the audio, you look at the timestamp. Oh, it's been 25 seconds into the call. You paste 25 seconds into like that variable of data, and like you go back and forth. And I think this is like, I'm a researcher, and your girl really likes her variables. So like we collect nearly 500 variables on any given cardiac arrest. And for dispatch calls, it's anywhere from like 20 to 40, depending on what happens during the dispatch calls. You can imagine that's a lot of like pressing pause, looking at the timestamp, pasting. So one 911 call can last 30 minutes, 40 minutes. If it's our average time to BLS arrival is 7 or 8 minutes from the start of the 911 call. So essentially like 4 to 5x of the 911 call, because you're pausing, playing, pausing, replaying. Oh, wait, what did they say? I will say, given novel technologies that we're using in our office, it's a smidge faster because you can do all of the stuff in a single platform and you can kind of drag, drop, move on. So it's just a little more streamlined.
Really, really cool. And well, actually, I have heard some agencies, it's taken them, I think it's particularly with complaint calls rather than cardiac arrest calls, but that's several hours. I guess that's maybe a different kettle of fish, though, not necessarily part of the QI process, but still interesting to see how there's a big difference between like the random sample calls that, yes, you can probably legitimately do those in a few minutes, the time it takes to listen to the call, plus maybe a little bit extra, but the cardiac arrest, and then all the way through to the complaint calls that are, yes, several hours of piecing together data across CAD systems, multiple audio recordings, radio, and so on.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So maybe this juncture is probably a good point. If you just share your screen, maybe we can hear a little bit more about what you've been doing at Seattle. And are you able to share your screen?
Yes, I should be able to share my screen. I did this backwards last time I did a lecture. So let's see if you see the right version of my screen. Are you seeing the right version, Henrik?
I can see the PowerPoint. So I assume that's the right one.
Without the notes, right?
Without the notes, that's right.
Guys, we're winning today. All right, so I wanted to do, I love a good list lecture because you know what to expect and how many slides there are going to be. So these are my 4 favorite misconceptions about quality improvement, because this is a hill I will die on. So to be clear, I technically have no disclosures, but obviously I do hang out with Corti a lot. So has anyone ever seen, has anyone like felt like this before? You have this brilliant idea and no one will listen, and everyone around you kind of has their blinders on and feels like they've improved their processes and that things are good enough. They've gotten into a workflow, it's smooth, nothing's really going wrong. There's like no reason to rock the boat. Well, misconception number 1 is that we're too busy for quality improvement. It's an excuse I've heard time and time again. And it's my favorite misconception because it's legitimately true. Like, we're all too busy. Busy is like my least, I consider busy a 4-letter word in the sense of like, think of a better word to explain how you spend your time. You're not busy. You're doing XYZ with your life. And this is particularly true if you don't actually have a dedicated QI officer. So while I do run QI and research for Seattle Medic One, Seattle Fire needs to have their own QI officer within like the uniform ranks too. But it's also false, because if you don't do QI as a process, it's going to cost you time on the back end anyway. So in this example, oddly, my caveman example is absurd, but I've already said Henrik's the Wizard of Oz, so really we're just going to go with it. If the caveman would take the time and energy to change the wheels from the square wheels to the round wheels, they would save time and energy moving their cart on the back end. You can imagine how this analogy applies elsewhere. The reality is, if you want to prioritize QI into your workflow, you can. It just takes some intentionality and recognition that you're going to shake up the usual processes, but it can be done. Within the theoretical framework of quality improvement, yes, there's a little bit of theory in my lecture, don't judge me. This is best shown via kind of the Swiss cheese model of errors. So let's play on the kind of worst case scenario of a 911 call of not identifying a cardiac arrest at the time of the 911 call. It's not a single event or process that leads to this error, at least typically. It's some combination of failures. But like the saying of like, no one goes to work trying to do a bad job applies in the circumstances of a misidentification of a cardiac arrest call. So sometimes things are outside of our control, like a secondhand caller or language barriers. These fall more in the quote unquote latent condition side of things. The reality is these kinds of errors, we can't really prevent them from happening, but there are solutions to alleviating their detrimental impact on those losses at the end of kind of the Swiss cheese model. On the other end of the spectrum are the more active failures, which are often phrased as kind of human error, quote unquote. And these are things like not appreciating agonal respirations or thinking a fall is just a fall without confirming consciousness. More often than not, the latter are mistakes that should be forgiven at the individual level, but that doesn't mean there isn't something we can do at the organizational or structural level to help safeguard against them from happening again. So with this misconception, either we invest in front-end evaluation or we pay with back-end corrections. Misconception number 2 is that identifying the bad apples is the most important use of time. This is my least favorite misconception. I hate the bad apple theory. There's a lot of very strong emotions right now. Maybe I'm sleep deprived. In part because it reflects a rather kind of old school mentality of this is how we've always done things around here, and around how we can like change behavior within an organization. The idea that the source of all of our problems can be blamed on a select group of individuals or a single individual is rarely true. But we waste an inordinate amount of time and resources believing otherwise. This focus on bad apples is where quality assurance comes into play. There is nothing wrong with setting thresholds or holding people to certain standards. However, if you only focus on the low performers, then you don't move the needle on the system as a whole. You just make your low performers look more like your middle of the pack performers, and often with a substantial investment in time and energy. There's a reason your low performers are low performers. If instead we focus our energy on the entire system of performers and thus help everyone improve, we move the fuel gauge rather than just the needle. This is why, in general, I hate the construct of QA, although it is part of QI. An interesting example of this from my work with Corti is our evaluation of the time to detection of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest and our comparison of the Seattle Fire Department to the system within Perth, Australia. Let's be clear, both locations do a relatively good job of identifying their cases during a 911 call, but Seattle is just a smidge faster. It's not a competition. One of the biggest differences in our two systems is that Perth asks for the callback number at the start of the 911 call, whereas Seattle asks for it at the end. If you remove the time it takes for the Perth folks to ask for that callback number, all of a sudden our time to detection for cardiac arrest calls becomes very similar between the two cases. I am not the Corti sales pitch part of this presentation, but this is a really interesting example, at least to my nerdy self as a researcher and a QI person, about how we wouldn't have been able to identify this difference between the two systems if we hadn't had the technology access that we have. The antithesis of misconception number 2 is that a rising tide lifts all boats. Misconception number 3 is that we have no way to link outcomes. There is nothing to improve. So with out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, this misconception simply doesn't work because 9 times out of 10, the dispatch center is going to get immediate feedback that CPR is in progress. I'm sure there are exceptions to this where there are some 911 centers that literally don't get any feedback. but I can imagine a number of times when somebody goes on the radio, hey, CPR in progress, you know exactly what I'm saying. And thus, you know the diagnosis. Additionally, out-of-hospital cardiac arrest is so well studied, you can use benchmarks created via research to evaluate your system's performance. The American Heart Association has some well-accepted benchmarks around telephone CPR. No lie, it gets a little messier the less sick a patient is. So in Seattle, we have a tiered response system. So there's a huge focus on kind of sending the right level of resources to the right patient in the right amount of time, because sometimes we just don't send a paramedic. That being said, even in Seattle, sometimes it's just easier to use dispatch data because that tells me which patients got which level of response and which patients eventually ended up being transported. So while dispatch data isn't what I'd call a gold standard diagnosis, I don't know if the patient formerly had a stroke or a STEMI or were septic. I can get a pretty good read on whether or not the patient was sick enough to require kind of advanced level care to the hospital, at least reasonably so. So call it like a silver standard diagnosis. Well, there should be some variation in kind of how often a dispatcher gets the diagnosis, quote unquote, correct. In instances such as this, I can actually turn to the high performers who get it correct more often and evaluate their performance for a better understanding of what good looks like and modify the system from there. So silver standard diagnoses are a reasonable replacement when gold standard diagnoses aren't available. Misconception number 4, QI is too difficult. Just because something is hard doesn't mean it isn't the right thing to do. Let's be real. The science behind QI is the easy part. It's the culture change that allows you to change behavior that is the hard part. This is where we get the all too common iceberg analogy. What you see above the surface are the formal rules and regulations of an organization, the SOPs, the protocols, yada, yada. While these play a part in how an organization and its members behave, the real power is below the surface where perceptions, traditions, and the unwritten rules dictate behavior. Sometimes the right thing to do is also the hard thing to do. All right, Henrik, I'll get off my soapbox.
That was really, really interesting. So how is that applied actually? Like, can you give an example of how you've been using that at Seattle?
So a recent example for us on the diagnosis one, where we're just using CAD or dispatch data, is actually chest pain calls. So we get thousands of chest pain calls. And realistically, how often is someone with chest pain actively having a cardiac or having a heart attack, having a full-blown STEMI where they need an intervention within the next hour? It's pretty rare. And so we have a lot of data just across the various dispatchers of variation in how they choose to interpret. For folks on the call, I should clarify, Seattle does a very open-ended dispatch system. It's very much like dispatcher. There are protocols, and there is kind of a process of how we move through a call, but there's a lot of flexibility given to the dispatchers once they establish consciousness and normal breathing. So we get variation across various dispatchers in how we treat chest pain. And rather than trying to link, because just like data is hard, right? Like I literally, that note where I said this is hard was me writing code on a Saturday and I couldn't figure it out. So I figured if I wrote it on a whiteboard and said this is hard, it would magically go away. It did not magically go away, but I felt better afterwards. So rather than trying to link the hospital level outcomes, which are super hard to get, it takes a big leap of infrastructure, I can take the next best thing and say, hey, even if like the average is an assumption of good enough, which dispatchers are high performers and just getting it more correct, and which dispatchers are low performers and getting it less correct across chest pain, and what are the differences in how those two cohorts of dispatchers behave? Do I have an answer for you yet? No, that's one of our fellows projects, so she's currently evaluating it.
So how does that actually, and maybe not in that example, but how have you, what sort of interventions have you taken and optimizations to actually change behavior?
We've changed some of the protocols. So we also, another one that we went through recently was the kind of active childbirth. I don't know if other folks have gone through this, but COVID has brought us a couple of really gnarly childbirth calls where it's like, wait, you should be at the hospital already. And so we realized that our protocols, we hadn't really like tried and true tested these active childbirth protocols. And so we applied those lessons we learned, and we're kind of immediately able to spin them into where did failure occur on this call? What questions should we have asked to better understand kind of the urgency of the situation? And then also in cases where the baby was imminent, what were the instructions that were missing from the call? And saying, hey, okay, we need to add a sentence here, add a sentence there.
If you keep on doing this, do you not eventually converge on a stricter protocol?
No, we would never do that. There would be a riot.
But isn't that the conclusion? If you continue this, right? You find better ways and validate better ways to ask questions or to.
Sure, but we also have 20 protocols, and we get 80,000 911 calls a year, and no two are alike. So I think we're gonna, sure, maybe we converge on a little bit less variation across our various protocols, and there's more consistency of use, but there's still flexibility, because at the end of the day, we don't always, like, we can claim we know what the right answer is every single time after we listen to a 911 call, but the reality is maybe we don't. We think we know what the best answer is most of the time. And so that's what our protocols are kind of, I'll call them guideposts / algorithms are currently written as. But this is like the model of think that you might be wrong, because you can always get 1% better. And so maybe, sure, it's a stricter protocol, but maybe there's a speed component, or there's a customer service component, or there's a language barrier component. Like there's always better ways to do something. No one's ever perfect.
So how can you tell the difference between good variation or variation that makes sense in the context and variation that you maybe want to reduce?
This is where a human has to apply knowledge and not a machine. I think it's like it passes the sniff test. It's like, no, this makes sense. This is you listen to a call and you're like, yeah, this was a good call. It makes sense. Not only did the dispatcher match the diagnosis with the limited information they had, but then also they did it in a way that conceptually made sense. And so, okay, how did they tweak the call? How did they change? How did they not follow the protocol that was actually better for the call? And the machine can guide you. But at the end of the day, this is not the Jetsons. So at some point, we are going to have to do some of the work.
It's really, really interesting to hear what you've been doing, right? And when you mentioned the analysis with Perth and Western Australia, what they've been like, how you identify. Oh, this is with Corti's help. There's
just a smidge of help from y'all.
But could you have done that sort of analysis beforehand?
You could have, but think about the amount of labor that would have taken. It was like, okay, sure, I can do time to detection. And so, you put a flag in and it's like, we detected this 911 call at 1 minute and 57 seconds. And that's just flagging the detection. And then it's like, okay, well, let's list out the order in which the questions were asked. And so, sure, we know in Seattle, you don't ask for the timestamp of the phone call, whereas in Perth you do. So it's kind of an obvious difference between the two processes. But do the dispatchers actually stick to those processes? And then figuring out, okay, how long does the question and answer cycle take? We're doing this a little bit with some pediatric telephone CPR research around like chest compression rates. It's an absurdly complicated project. And like, even with the Explore tool, it is still taking 30 minutes per 911 call to evaluate or to kind of label and listen all of these little minutia kind of question and answer, compression and pause things. Yeah. And so doing that without any technological help, it's not feasible. Like, no one pays me to, like, it just doesn't function. No, too busy doing other questions.
That's bad. Actually, as a side note, that reminds me of I was speaking with, I can't remember which agency it was, a couple of weeks ago, and they decided that they'd had like a theory that they were asking the address question too late, but they'd never been annotating when it would happen. They'd never been storing timestamps. So that then meant some poor student researcher had to sit down and annotate hundreds of calls over months so that they could eventually collect a data set just so that they could define the problem, right? Yep. We're not even getting into like actually conducting the intervention. analyzing if that had an effect or, anything beyond that. Just for identifying if this is even worth worrying about or intervening took them, 2-3 months.
And that's our traditional model, is we take these poor, unfortunate, rising second-year medical students, and they get this amazing opportunity to do research with Seattle Medic One, and then they just they kill their ears listening to a bunch of 911 calls and manually annotating them to potentially identify if there is an issue. And then if there is an issue, maybe there's a testable hypothesis there.
I think this is a good moment for me to maybe share my screen. Actually, am I sharing my screen already?
You are not.
I am not. Thank you for teaching me the Zoom ways. Am I now?
You're good.
There we go. So what I want to do is I actually want to talk you through some sort of practical examples of how we use artificial intelligence and how you can make that part of your sort of continuous quality improvement flow. So this is the same slides. There we go. What I want to start with, I think, Counts, this is probably quite familiar for you. I want to remind you what a typical sort of improvement process or framework looks like. This is one of the models that's called PDSA, or Plan, Do, Study, Adjust. And so it's basically you start with planning, you develop a hypothesis, you basically define the problem, set a baseline, design an experiment. Then you do, that is to say, actually carry out the intervention. And then you study, that is to say, measure if that intervention had any results. And that's effectively running the same sort of analysis you did at the plan stage and seeing, was there an improvement? Did it have the desired effect? And then finally, you adjust and iterate. If it didn't have the desired effect, maybe go back to the planning phase. If it did, but should you do it more? Are there some sort of next steps? 1 second. There we go. Just having a. But really, this is very easy when you have lots of data, right? But audio recordings, 911 calls, they're kind of like this black box. Unless you get a human, poor student researcher to annotate them or to transcribe them, it is a complete black box. You can do a lot of the sort of proxy metrics, as you mentioned, sort of things from like a CAD system or EHRs, but the actual core itself, you can't analyze that process. So that's why I want to talk about artificial intelligence. Really, it's what does it really mean when I say artificial intelligence? It's a bit of a buzzword. It's got a very broad definition. One of the first things I saw on Google when I was like, how can I describe this in the best way? It's anything that previously only a human could do that now a computer can do. So imagine sort of every 10 years, things that we called artificial intelligence is now just an algorithm. In the 1800s, you'd probably say a calculator was artificial intelligence. Now we're at a point where what we're doing now is artificial intelligence. So what we do, actually, just a little hold up. What I wanted to show is we use artificial intelligence to analyze every single one of your calls, right? That is, say, not 3%, as many of you wrote in the polls, or 0.5%, as I've heard in quite a few agencies. I know maybe some of you didn't write that in the poll, but I've heard that more often than you expect. Because it's artificial intelligence, it can process huge quantities of data. So what are we actually doing when I say huge quantities of data? Well, how we approach this problem of opening the black box of call recordings is that we work with the raw material itself. So we process that audio, and when I say we, this is actually what artificial intelligence can do. We just happen to do it particularly well, right? But there are other ways that you could do this. But Corti does this for a living, right? So we process this audio and we convert it into text. That is to say, we transcribe the audio. So now you can actually, for this snippet of audio, you can actually see what the audio wave is and what the people are saying. So in this case, it's a call taker up here, and then there's a caller responding. And so why do we convert it to text first? Why is that interesting? Well, text is so much easier to work with than audio. So instead of thousands of hours of audio files that sort of sit in some server and never get touched, and then every X number of months you have to delete it for privacy purposes or whatever, what we've made is the ability to actually search and analyze your calls. So it's kind of like your agency's own personal search engine for call recordings. So here, for example, we're searching for breathing, and you can find every single call where that comes up. I think that's pretty neat. But it's still just searching text, which is a little bit less smart than we'd like, right? So in this case, the word breathing comes up twice in this snippet, but the context of them differ. So in the first instance, the call taker is asking about breathing, whereas in the second, the caller is responding and confirming that, yes, the patient's breathing. So there is a nuance, there is a difference in the actual meaning of these two words, right? Or where they're used. And searching text alone doesn't really allow you to just differentiate between those two. So there are now algorithms out there, including the ones that we've developed at Corti, that can process this text and understand what it means. So it knows that this isn't just the word breathing, but it's actually a question. And it's the breathing status question. And it knows that this is the response. So it knows that, the caller has answered with, yes, the patient is breathing. And this is really, really useful for doing analysis. But you're probably wondering, that's cool. How do we use this for quality improvement though? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through a couple of examples of using this data and how that fits into your CQI process, and how we can actually convert that into specific results. So one of the things that I know pretty much every agency around the world cares about is call processing time, and it related cardiac arrest detection time, hands on chest, those sorts of metrics that are relating to speed to decision. Yes. So what I'm showing you here, the example I'm going to show is what you might do, and exactly as you mentioned, Counts, is that you'd map out all the questions that you'd ask typically in a call, right? Particularly maybe those that if you're trying to optimize to reduce dispatch time, map out all the ones you'd ask before dispatch. So in this case, we're looking at the patient consciousness question, and what this graph visualizes is the distribution across all calls for the time at which the call taker asked this particular question. And what's important to remember is that this query hasn't been defined in advance. So like the case I gave the agency that somebody wanted to start tracking the address time, and they had to then start analyzing data and doing months and months of data. This can work on retrospective data. So you can create this query at any time to say, I want to see patient consciousness questions across this entire data set I've just imported. And we can see it at the level of, every single second, how many times that question was detected in a call. So I can see that the question, I saw the data before, so I actually know the median is 43 seconds, which is around here. So the median time it took to ask patient consciousness is 43 seconds. That's fine. There's a bit of a long tail here that you might want to investigate further, but you'd probably move on to the next question and try and analyze that. So this one is a little bit different. We're looking at the when a call taker asks the caller for a callback number. So this is exactly the case you mentioned. And so they ask for it in case the call gets disconnected. What we see instead is two different peaks. One of which is very, very early on in the call. And actually, let me just overlay again. If I overlay those two questions, what you can actually see is that there are a lot of calls where the call taker is asking about callback number before they're asking about patient consciousness. Now, perhaps that makes sense, or perhaps not. But instead of just guessing, what you can actually do is go in and, exactly as you mentioned, you can go and listen to the call, because computers are great at identifying, here's the data, we've processed all of this crazy amount, and we've identified these are the things that you might want to investigate. But you do still need to listen into the audio. We're not quite at that point where artificial intelligence can do all our jobs for us. So we still do need to be part of this process, right? And so let's say, yes, we've decided this peak is unusual. We might want to create an intervention that changes that, right? So we can run an experiment and we can see how eventually that maybe moves things into more of a typical sort of distribution with just a single peak. That'll be a really good outcome. What we can also do with exactly the same sort of process, though, is we can look at optimizing question phrasing. Now, I know a lot of you, if you use the priority dispatch MPDS protocol, this might not be something you can do, but I know certainly in Seattle, they have complete control over their protocols. So this sort of analysis becomes really interesting. And the one, I know there's a lot of literature on this one, but how to phrase the question about if the patient is conscious. Or should you ask, in fact, are they awake? Or maybe combine them and say, is the patient conscious and awake? Which I think is what you do in Seattle now, actually, if I'm not completely mistaken.
I think we still have variation on this one.
That's interesting. And have you ever done an analysis on that variation?
Not yet.
An opportunity
Henrik,
arises.
I have so many project ideas and so little time. Don't worry, it's in the spreadsheet.
That's amazing, right? So this is an example, right, where we can start saying, what is the variation, and what causes it? So there's a couple of ways we can actually look at this though and see how it has an effect. So a couple of ideas I first thought of: time to unique next question. That is, say, how long did it take to ask this question and then get onto the next question? The number of times the question has to be repeated before you actually get a proper answer. And then you can also sort of take out and compare all the times where maybe the question, is she conscious, was asked versus is she awake, and compare how that affected triaging accuracy, for example. So I know in Seattle, they spend a lot of time, and you spend a lot of time looking at upgrade and downgrade reports. Let us say cases where a call taker sent a higher priority and then it got, they perhaps over triaged, and also vice versa. So that's another sort of analysis that you can do. And just to put that into context, here's an example transcript. And so the time it took, so with the transcript on the left, we can bring out this sort of data of saying it actually took, in this one particular call, 12.2 seconds to get from asking the initial question through to the next question. Now, of course, on an individual call level, this isn't particularly useful, right? There's so many different variables that can affect why a single question might take longer, or in the same way, why a single question might have to be repeated. Here, you said she's having chest pain, has to be asked twice. But across your entire data set, that is, say, every single call, then this becomes a really interesting sort of data point, because if you aggregate that, you can start, it sort of averages out the variation. Another one, I know that protocol adherence is very important for some agencies. We don't, of course, want to see this as like flagging. So let's say your protocol says you must say, is she or is he conscious? You can flag those cases of where there are deviations. Now, as we heard before, we don't want to call out people just because they deviate, right? That was fallacy number 2, misconception number 2, I do remember. But it's about, are there trends? Are there reasons why people are deviating from the protocol at certain points, right? Are there particular types of calls where people are deviating? Are there particular call takers that are deviating? And are they actually getting better results, perhaps? And then the final one, and this is something that we developed completely in-house. We've developed a machine learning model that can analyze a call, and then it can predict what level of severity on a 5-point scale, what level of severity the call is. And so this is something we've developed alongside Seattle and 2 or 3 other agencies around the world. So in this case, we figured it's a red. I think it's on the NPDS scale, that's sort of the second tier severity, if you will. And again, as I said, on an individual call level, this might be useful, but where it becomes really, really interesting is aggregating that data across all your call takers or across all your protocols. And I can see you're smiling there.
Henrik, I'm so proud of you. You made a funnel plot.
Yes, I was taught how to make a funnel plot by you guys a few months ago, and now I love them. So I'm completely convinced. What we're really showing here, right? So on the x-axis is the number of incidences, and then the y is the rate at which they, in this case, they under triage. So they sent too low a priority. And so we can, even if you don't have the result from paramedics of whether it was an over triage case or an under triage case, we can actually compare what Corti thought it was based on our machine learning model and what the call taker selected. So it's a really good proxy for identifying those cases where there is deviation from what normal call takers do. And so here we can see there's one call taker who is, there are more cases where they are under triaging than you'd expect. And on the other hand, there's a person down here who is a little bit below this control line. I think this control limit is set at sort of 2 standard deviations or something along those lines. So that was, I think, 4 different use cases. So from reducing call time, optimizing question phrasing, protocol adherence, and actually reducing cases of over and under triaging, all that we can do just with data. And Corti specializes in this. We've worked with a lot of EMS agencies now, developed our machine learning purely for this, and to answer a lot more questions on top of what we've just seen today. So we're working this is now a little bit about how we do this within our product. So instead of you having to create your own machine learning infrastructure and pipeline, we've made a really simple interface for flagging calls that are anomalous and that probably should get a manual review, tracking trends across your organization, digging deep into some of those more specific queries you might do. So if you wanted to conduct a analysis like we did in Western Australia and Seattle for those the questions, that's all something that you can do really, really simply with the new version of Corti that we're rolling out. Even overlay that on a map if you want to track trends across a geographic area. This is Seattle. I think this is mock data, so don't start asking me where.
This better not be current. There is way less. We're the first city in the U.S. to reach 70% vaccination rate, so this is not current data. I'm going to just disclosure statement. Seattle
was also the first city to have the first confirmed case of COVID, though. If we're going to be
we're real special.
Very particular. So there's a hell of a lot that you can do with artificial intelligence, and we've tried to develop a platform and a pipeline for making this really, really easy and to fit right into your CQI process. But I think on that note, I think we can take some questions from the people watching. I don't know if there's a button I can press on Zoom, or if how
Henrik,
best to facilitate
the way this works is there's a Q&A button at the bottom where people can submit questions, or they can just type them in the chat.
Okay, so I've clicked the Q&A button, and you can also type questions in the chat. And I see we've already got one from Tim. What QI feedback has been the most important one so far? I guess that's probably a question most for you. Yeah. In terms of the most valuable, I guess, right?
I think I don't know if I have an operationalized answer for this yet, but I think what we've realized is humans are really strongly respond to comparison. And so, Henrik pulled up a funnel plot, and the funnel plot essentially shows you positive and negative deviance. And we realize that the power of data allows you to identify. And so maybe you only know which dot is yours, but you don't know who anybody else is. But it lets you understand, oh, I'm actually not doing as good as my peers. And that can be a really powerful motivator and create some intrinsic motivation. Because as much as I can be a coach and say, go you're doing a great job, let's keep it up, here's where you need to excel, you have to believe that you might have an area to improve on, or you're not going to change your behavior. So I think I would say this.
So you'd actually be showing this sort of data to call takers as well, right?
That's the long-term play. We have this kind of data we've actually shared on our first pass success for innovation, and kind of without complications, let's be clear, because it's not a good first pass unless you don't have hypoxia, et cetera. The medics on the call know what I'm talking about. But sorry, Henrik. So yeah, like this data is really powerful if it's presented in a culturally sensitive way. Because if you just like paste it on the wall and give everybody like a de-identified number and don't give them the tools to change, it doesn't do any good. I have to give you hey, here's how you're doing, and here's where I think you could improve. Here's how I think you could improve, or else where you are compared to the rest of the group doesn't really matter.
That makes a lot of sense. And so how do you actually like measure the success of this though? Like these sorts of
well, you do another funnel plot.
You do another funnel plot, and then you just hope there are fewer in there.
So this is like a PDSA cycle, right? All right, I see a funnel plot. I've got a positive deviant. The positive deviant, we'll just use the phone number example. The positive deviant asks the phone number, the callback number later. And so I say, hey guys, we're going to change our protocol and we're going to start asking phone number at the end of the 911 call. Let's see if I can at least, not only does my positive deviant not change, because supposedly their behavior should stay the same, but does my funnel plot get tighter because there's less variation? And then also, do my negative deviants become more in line with kind of the confidence interval of such? And this is PDSA, cycles over time. Okay, cool. Did we see a shift in our performance on a control chart? Did our time to detection go down because all of a sudden we stopped asking a 12-second question?
So how do you know that the intervention, if you're trying to push more people towards the positive deviant, would you, just take this one, would you expect to see, so the positive deviant, I guess this one, you'd expect the entire set to move down, right?
If I successfully push everyone, right? But the reality is there's early adopters and there's late adopters, and then there's just laggards, even in an individual organization. So not everyone's going to listen to me immediately when I say, hey, we've changed our protocols, or hey, I think you should do this. That's definitely a Seattle problem, is we aren't very like concrete in our protocols. We like to nudge behavior before we mandate behavior. And so you can imagine it takes kind of continuous evaluation. And so you look at this chart over time, and this chart plus a control or a run chart, and you see, hey, has our time to detection decreased over time? Is if we only made one change in the system and we changed the order in which we ask questions, then presumptively we can blame that intervention on the changing data. Presumptively, it's not always real life, but
I don't know if you can see the question that
I can.
That's come in.
Well, there's a few of them, so I would like you to pick one.
Okay, so the from the Q&A pop-up, at least that came in. So do the dispatchers in Seattle have any medical training, such as EMT or paramedic? I can understand if dispatchers deviate from a protocol based on clinical decision-making, but I'm curious to know if there's any data out there that support the pros and cons of medically trained dispatchers versus non-medically trained dispatchers.
This is such a politically charged question. So in the city of Seattle, we use firefighters at our dispatch center. Those firefighters are either EMTs, or sometimes we even have paramedics. It is our opinion that we feel their medical exposure and their medical training and their time on the street, so to say, helps them understand the system better. But the reality is that's a model that works for us. That doesn't mean that's going to be a model that works for everyone. I do not know the literature on it.
Fair enough. I'm not going to pretend I can answer that. Another question from Anonymous. Do you do more call reviews now that you have these tools, or more, or the same amount, and spend the other time on improvement and training efforts?
So I'm in a weird spot because I'm the quality improvement / research manager. So for me, it's, I don't do the culture change part of the process. I do the fishbone diagram of, hey, I've identified this trend in behavior, and we go to the call center. We say, what do you think? How do you think we should change these protocols? And there's kind of like an ongoing dialogue of which the process be changed. But to answer your first question, absolutely, the Explore tool for me, I would say it makes us 50 to 75% faster on a call. And it's cleaner, it's easier to identify kind of the data that's already in the call versus your stereotypical, I have to download the call, I have to save it, I have to find it, and then I have to press play. And like, it's kind of a one-stop shop for all the data. And that's just really helped me. And then because it's an internet platform, I don't need like special computer access. I can do it from anywhere, which #pandemic lifestyles, like that's also made it way easier for my team to just review these cases.
I guess you've also had more time to now do more quality improvement.
What's time, Henrik?
I know you're one of the busiest people I know, so maybe that's
busy
not
is a 4-letter word. Yes, no, I have done more case review, and yes, the knowledge is transferred somehow. But I don't want to claim that I'm doing more, because I, honest to God, would just have to check my calendar to see if I've actually accomplished more than I thought I did.
We've got a couple more questions. How would you like to handle QI human hazards, where the cause is more important than the present health status, poison situations? I.e., this health status may not have reached a dangerous level, but will eventually.
Huh? I don't completely understand this question. I'm sorry. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe you want to. I think this is like, they're not currently dead, but they're close to dying. Is that what you mean? Like they poison themselves, and so we've got a little bit of time, but not a lot of time. Is that where you're going?
I mean, as a side note, how much do you QA or QI, but review? Non-cardiac arrest calls. So what other like focus areas do you actually have?
Yeah, so I call these verticals. So definitely cardiac arrest, and we're already looking at chest pain because that's just such a big bucket of data. And then we are also looking at strokes. We really think there's a lot of value in identifying those large vessel occlusion strokes to make sure that they get paramedics and they get transported to the right hospital versus going to a non-LVO prepared center. So those, and then we're starting to kind of think about the acuity spectrum and thinking about those lower acuity calls. So do they even need an EMT level response, or can we shift them to another kind of more social services model?
And then I think kind of what Birgit is also asking is then with the cases where it's a developing situation, and it could be like end up being not low acuity, but like a non-emergency. Like, how do you do analysis on those sorts of cases? Is that something that's a focus for you?
Yeah, so I think this is where that gold versus silver standard comes into play. So the funny thing about, remember that data where there were 2 humps in the time of the callback number? The funny part is if the caller is the patient, then the callback number might actually be appropriately asked at the very beginning, depending on the circumstances of the call. Because if they're awake and they're conscious and they're like, my chest hurts, all right, well, let me make sure I have your callback number in case we get disconnected. Because at that point, I know you're alive and I know you're breathing. So I think it depends on it depends on like the clinical vertical that is the almost really sick cohort as to how it gets handled. But definitely, I think this tool helps because it's like, those are the messy ones, right? It's the gray zone of, okay, do I send the BLS crew and have them evaluate the patient and then activate the ALS crew? Or maybe the dispatcher sent the ALS crew and then the BLS crew downgraded the ALS crew, and kind of which mixture was the right mixture?
I think 2 more questions. And then I think we can wrap it up. One from more quickly coming in. What idealistic feature would you want to include? So completely clouds the limit feature.
Oh, I'm so excited about these, like this, you know, you joked about, oh, okay, I can find the word breathing. I am so excited about out of hospital cardiac arrest distractions. So these, like, think like seizures, right? Those are a fun distraction, or they fell, and how distractions get described, and some kind of easy way to search these calls and do analysis on when we fall for the distraction, how bad is it? And how do we not fall for the distraction?
Okay. That's going to be interesting. I look forward to it.
It's on my list, Henrik. It's on my list.
Your list is getting longer by the day. Maybe I should show you less of our products so you stop dreaming less, and you can get some of that list done.
That's silly.
Next on the list, we have 2 more questions. You mentioned customer service. How does that fit in with versus your focus on clinical verticals and hypotheses?
So customer service, I think it helps with, like, does the dispatcher create a positive dialogue with the caller? And recognizing that if presumptively, if there's a bad customer service, and I hate using the word bad, but if there's a more negative customer service experience and the call taker kind of seems like they're coming at this from like an immediate assumption of bias, how do they fail to identify the appropriate kind of clinical construct that that patient is in? And that's where I think that really plays a role. And then Nicole has a similar question about discipline. And no, I think anytime we're doing QI, when I do stuff within the QI construct, unless someone intentionally violated the rules to cause harm, it's not a dispatch question. And even then, that does not fall within my purview. My job is making sure we improve the system overall. And so hopefully if there's a dispatch or there's a disciplinary type thing, someone else is also reporting it, because I don't want a QI process to be used for discipline, because then people don't trust the QI process as being used for good.
I think on that note, we should leave it here. Thank you so much, very, very, very much for joining us, for like coming in onto the webinar and presenting. It has been really, really interesting.